Grace Taylor adjusted her grip on the worn leather strap of her bag as she approached the gleaming glass doors of Summit Marksman Club. The afternoon sun reflected off the building's polished facade, revealing glimpses of the opulent world inside. Members in expensive shooting gear, crystal trophy cases, and walls lined with certificates of achievement. Grace's plain navy blouse and faded grey jeans made her feel like she was wearing a neon sign that read, "Doesn't belong here." Inside, the crack of gunfire echoed from the ranges while members clustered around the lobby's marble bar, their conversations punctuated by the clink of expensive whiskey glasses. At the center of it all stood Preston Vaughan, regional shooting champion for 6 consecutive years and son of a state senator. His sun-kissed face wore the kind of confident smile that came from never having to worry about money, status, or proving himself to anyone. Grace approached the reception desk where a blonde woman was reapplying her lipstick in a compact mirror. The receptionist's eyes swept over Grace's appearance. No diamond ring, no designer watch, no obvious signs of wealth. "Hi, I'd like to book a shooting session today," Grace said quietly. The woman didn't look up from her mirror. "Members only, ma'am." Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. "I have an invitation. A friend gave me a day pass." The heavy thud of a loaded gun case hitting the marble floor interrupted their conversation. Preston Vaughan, having overheard the exchange, turned his attention to the unfamiliar woman. His eyes took in her modest appearance with obvious amusement. "Well, damn, did Walmart have a gun sale today?" Preston's voice carried deliberately across the grand lobby, drawing chuckles from his circle of friends. Grace lowered her head, but said nothing. She simply followed the receptionist's reluctant directions toward the beginner's range, her worn sneakers silent against the polished floor. Behind her, she could hear Preston's laughter, mixing with the approving murmurs of his audience. Rebecca Lynn, the club manager, caught the exchange from across the lobby. A flicker of disapproval crossed her face, but she remained silent. At Summit, money talked louder than manners, and Preston's family donated generously to keep their status unquestioned. As Grace walked toward the shooting line, she unconsciously twisted the simple wedding ring on her left hand, a habit she'd developed over the past 3 years. She had no idea that this gesture, dismissed by everyone as nervousness, was actually her way of summoning strength from a memory that still lived in her heart. The stage was set. An ordinary woman with an extraordinary past, about to face a man who had never learned the meaning of humility. At the farthest shooting stall, Grace carefully unpacked her equipment. Her gear was functional, but clearly well used. A standard Glock 19 that had seen better days, basic eye protection, and simple ear guards. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. The contrast with the custom rifles and high-end equipment around her was stark. Preston and his friends had gravitated toward the nearby stalls, unwilling to miss what they assumed would be entertainment. They whispered among themselves, their voices carrying just enough for Grace to hear. "10 grand says she's never even fired a gun," Preston announced loudly, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Mom, you sure you're in the right place? This is a shooting club, not a knitting circle." Grace looked up from her preparations, her brown eyes meeting his without flinching. "I'm just here to practice," she replied softly. Preston's friends laughed, interpreting her quiet response as confirmation of their assumptions. One of them, a man wearing a $3,000 competition vest, shook his head in amusement. "This should be good. She probably thinks the safety's a suggestion." "Look at that stance," another whispered. "She's holding it like she's afraid it's going to bite her." But Rebecca Lynn, watching from the manager's office window, noticed something different. Grace's movements weren't hesitant, they were deliberate. Her breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. Her shoulders had squared in a way that suggested muscle memory, not uncertainty. Preston, emboldened by his audience, stepped closer to Grace's stall. "Tell you what, sweetheart, how about a little friendly wager? If you can hit a bullseye at 50 yards, I'll give you $10,000. If not, you pack up that garage sale special and find somewhere more appropriate to play." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Around them, other shooters had stopped their practice, sensing drama. The whispered conversations died down as everyone waited for Grace's response. She looked down at her left hand, where her wedding ring caught the fluorescent light. She turned it gently, that unconscious habit again, and then nodded quietly. "Right." The crowd gathered, expecting to witness a comedy. They had no idea they were about to see something that would silence the entire room. Grace reached for her Glock, and in that moment, something shifted. Her movements became fluid, practiced, almost ceremonial. She was no longer the awkward outsider they dismissed. She was someone else entirely. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. As Grace adjusted her stance, years of muscle memory kicked in. Her feet found their position automatically, her grip settled into place with practiced ease. The chattering crowd began to quiet, sensing something they couldn't quite identify. Preston's smile wavered for just a moment as he watched her preparation. This wasn't the fumbling amateur he'd expected. Her movements were too precise, too natural. But he pushed the doubt away. She was still just some nobody with an old gun. 50 yards, he called out, his voice projecting confidence he was starting not to feel. "That's the challenge. Don't worry if you miss by a mile. It happens to the best of us." Grace said nothing. She simply raised the Glock, her breathing becoming so controlled it seemed to stop entirely. The range fell silent except for the distant hum of the ventilation system. The shot rang out like a declaration. When the target was reeled in, a perfect round hole sat dead center in the bullseye. The silence that followed was deafening, a stunned, disbelieving quiet that seemed to stretch forever. Preston's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, denial, and finally, something harder. He snatched the target from the range assistant's hands, holding it up to examine it under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Lucky shot," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Anyone can get lucky once." "That wasn't luck, Rebecca," Lynn said quietly, stepping closer to observe. "I've been managing this range for 15 years. That was technique." The murmurs started then. Hushed conversations, shifting feet, the uncomfortable rustling of people, reassessing what they'd just witnessed. Grace calmly began packing her equipment, ignoring the stares and whispered speculation. Preston's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being upstaged, especially not by someone like her. As Grace moved toward the exit, he called after her. "Who are you really?" Grace paused at the door, turning back with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout the encounter. "I'm someone keeping a promise." After she left, Preston pulled out his phone, his expression dark. Pride was one thing, but what he'd just witnessed was something else entirely. She hadn't just gotten lucky, she'd made that shot with the kind of precision that came from serious training. "Find me everything about her," he said into the phone. "Name, address, job history. And most importantly, find out who taught her to shoot like that." Something told him Grace Taylor's story was far from over. 3 days later, Grace returned to Summit Marksman Club for what she thought would be a quiet practice session. She'd hoped the incident with Preston had been forgotten, but the moment she walked through the doors, she knew otherwise. The receptionist's greeting was colder than before, and conversations seemed to stop when she passed. Grace made her way to the same shooting stall, trying to ignore the attention. Preston appeared within minutes, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd brought what looked like half the club's board of directors, along with several local shooting instructors and even a reporter from the regional sports magazine. "Grace Taylor," Preston announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The mystery woman who thinks she can walk into our club and embarrass our members." Grace continued setting up her equipment, but Preston wasn't finished. "I've done some checking," he continued, his voice carrying that familiar edge of superiority. "Turns out you're just an accountant from a low-rent apartment complex. No competitive experience, no formal training, no business being here with serious shooters." The gathered crowd murmured their agreement. Grace felt the weight of their judgment, the assumption that someone like her, someone ordinary, had no right to challenge their world. "Here's what's going to happen," Preston said, stepping closer. "I'm challenging you to a formal competition. 1 week from today, 10 stations, varying distances and weapons, public match with official judges, winner takes $50,000. The crowd stirred with excitement. This was better than they'd hoped for, a real spectacle. "And when you lose," Preston continued, his smile sharp as a blade, "you're banned from Summit for life. No more day passes, no more charity cases cluttering up our facility." Grace felt something break inside her chest, not from fear, but from the final recognition that this wasn't about marksmanship anymore. This was about respect, dignity, and the right to exist in spaces that people like Preston believed belonged only to them. She looked up at him, her brown eyes steady and calm. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made several people in the crowd lean forward to hear. "I accept your challenge," she said, "but when I win, the prize money gets donated entirely to the American Veterans Support Fund." The murmur that went through the crowd wasn't mockery this time, it was shock. Preston's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before returning. "Deal?" he said, extending his hand. "This should be entertaining." As they shook hands, Grace twisted her wedding ring one more time. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. That evening, Grace sat in her small Denver apartment, staring at the phone in her hands. She'd been debating this call for hours, knowing that making it would change everything. Finally, she dialed. "Logan Harris?" The voice that answered was cautious, professional. "Logan, it's Grace. Grace Rhodes." A long pause. "Grace? Jesus, it's been 3 years. How are you holding up?" "I need your help," she said simply. "I just challenged Preston Vaughan to a shooting competition." The silence on the other end stretched. So long, Grace wondered if the call had dropped. When Logan finally spoke, his voice was incredulous. "You challenged Preston Vaughan? Do you know who he is? This guy has money, influence, and connections that go all the way to the state capitol. He doesn't just compete, he destroys people who cross him." "I know," Grace said quietly, "but I can't back down now." Logan sighed. "Ethan trained you well, but Preston's been doing this professionally for years. He's got access to equipment you've never even seen, coaches who charge more per hour than most people make in a week. Then I guess I'll have to be better than his equipment and coaches." Another pause, then Logan's voice softened. "Ethan always said you had ice in your veins when it mattered." "All right, Grace, I'll help you. But we're going to train like your life depends on it." The next morning, Grace met Logan at an old military shooting range 30 miles outside Denver. The facility was basic: concrete shooting stations, worn targets, and equipment that had seen better decades, but it was private, and more importantly, it was where Ethan had trained when he was stationed at Fort Carson. "Before we start," Logan said, pulling a worn notebook from his gear bag, "Ethan wanted you to have this if anything ever happened to him. He made me promise to give it to you when you were ready." Grace opened the notebook with trembling hands. Page after page of Ethan's handwriting filled the margins, wind correction formulas, range calculations, scope adjustments, and detailed notes about every weapon he'd ever mastered. On the first page, in his careful script, were the words, "For Grace, because strength isn't about the weapon you carry, it's about the reason you're carrying it." For the next 7 days, Grace and Logan trained 12 hours a day. Logan had served with Ethan in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he knew exactly what her husband had been trying to prepare her for. They worked through every scenario, every type of weapon, every possible challenge Preston might throw at her. By the end of the week, something had awakened in Grace that had been sleeping since Ethan's death. It wasn't just her marksmanship skills, it was the part of herself that refused to be broken, no matter how hard the world tried. She was ready. The morning of the competition, Summit Marksman Club looked like a different place entirely. Electronic. Scoreboards had been erected, spectator seating installed, and local media crews were setting up their equipment. What had started as Preston's private humiliation of an outsider had become a public spectacle. Grace arrived wearing the same simple clothes she'd worn the first day, a plain cotton shirt and worn jeans. The only addition was a small fabric pouch on her hip containing Ethan's notebook. As she walked through the crowd of sponsors, competitors, and spectators, she could feel the weight of their expectations. Preston made his entrance like a champion boxer walking to the ring. His competition suit bore multiple sponsor logos, and he was trailed by coaches, equipment managers, and a small camera crew documenting what everyone assumed would be his easy victory. Rebecca Lynn approached Grace near the equipment check station, her expression grim. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Some of the weapons at the stations have been adjusted. Not in your favor?" Grace nodded calmly. "I figured he wouldn't make it easy. Thanks for the warning." "There's something else," Rebecca continued, glancing around nervously. "Preston's been bragging to the board about having you investigated. He knows about Ethan, about his military service. He's planning to use it against you somehow for the..." First time since arriving, Grace's composure cracked slightly. Ethan's memory was sacred to her. If Preston tried to dishonor that, the gloves would come off completely. The competition began with great fanfare. Stations 1 through 4 went as expected. Preston had slight advantages with the modern competition. Rifles, but Grace held steady, never letting the gap widen significantly. The crowd was engaged but not yet amazed. Station 5 changed everything. The weapon was a Sig Sauer P226 with a trigger pull that felt wrong the moment Grace picked it up. It was too heavy, the reset, sluggish, clear signs of tampering. But instead of complaining or asking for a replacement, Grace simply adjusted her technique, drawing on lessons Ethan had taught her about adapting to faulty equipment. Her shots found their marks with mechanical precision. Stations 6 through 8 featured tactical weapons, rifles similar to what Ethan had used overseas. This was Grace's domain now, and it showed. Her technique wasn't flashy or theatrical like Preston's, but it was flawless. Each shot placed exactly where she intended, with a consistency that began to unnerve even Preston's supporters. By Station 9, something had shifted in the crowd. The cheers for Preston had quieted, replaced by an attentive silence as people began to realize they might be witnessing something extraordinary. Preston, feeling the momentum slip away, made his first critical mistake. as Grace prepared for the final station. He leaned close enough for only her to hear. "You know, I did my homework on you, Mrs. Rhodes. Found out all about your husband, the great phantom sniper. Too bad he couldn't phantom his way out of that roadside bomb, huh?" Grace's hand stilled on her weapon. For a moment, the entire range seemed to hold its breath. When she turned to look at Preston, her eyes held something that made him take an involuntary step backward. "You just made this personal," she said quietly. "That was a mistake." Station 10 featured the Macmillan TAC 338, a heavy-duty sniper rifle designed for extreme precision at long range. It was Preston's favorite weapon, the one he'd used to win multiple championships. As Rebecca handed Grace the rifle, she whispered a final warning. "The scope's been misaligned. We didn't have time to fix it without causing a scene." Grace opened Ethan's notebook to a page marked with a small photo of the two of them at their wedding. In his precise handwriting, she found the entry she needed. Macmillan offset compensation, western wind conditions, adjust up 0.2 degrees, right 1 click. Even 3 years after his death, Ethan was still teaching her. Preston shot first, his movements confident and practiced. 9 shots out of 10 hit the center ring, an excellent score that would have won most competitions. The crowd applauded, appreciatively, assuming the contest was over. Then Grace stepped up to the line. She made the scope adjustments exactly as Ethan's notes instructed, her movements calm and deliberate. As she settled into position, the entire range fell silent. Even the media crews stopped their commentary, sensing they were about to witness something special. The first shot rang out clear and true. Bullseye. The second shot followed immediately after. Another perfect hit. By the 4th shot, the crowd had gone completely quiet. By the 7th, people were holding their breath. On the 8th shot, one of Preston's crew members tried to distract her by reflecting light off a metal surface into her scope, a desperate, illegal attempt at sabotage. Grace simply closed her eyes for 2 seconds, drawing on Ethan's training. Close your eyes, open your focus. When she opened them and fired, the shot was perfect. Shots 9 and 10 followed in rapid succession, both finding the exact center of the target. 10 shots, 10 perfect bullseyes. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire world had stopped to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. Then Rebecca Lynn held up the final scorecard. Grace Taylor, perfect score, winner. The crowd erupted in applause, but Grace barely heard it. She was looking at her wedding ring, twisting it gently one more time. Preston approached her, his face a mixture of shock and grudging respect. "Congratulations," he said, extending his hand. "But you haven't won at life yet." Grace took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "I don't need to win at life," she replied. "Winning against myself is enough." As she walked away from the shooting line, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. She had honored Ethan's memory not with grief, but with grace under pressure and unshakable resolve. Behind her, the crowd was still buzzing with excitement, but Grace was already thinking about tomorrow and how she might use this moment to help others find their own strength. The video went viral within hours. Security footage from the competition showed not just Grace's perfect shooting, but also the attempts at sabotage, Preston's crew tampering with equipment and using reflective surfaces to distract her during the final shots. The footage spread far beyond shooting sports circles, becoming a symbol of quiet determination, triumphing over privilege and dirty tactics. 3 days later, Summit Marksman Club called an emergency board meeting. Rebecca Lynn stood before the assembled members, holding an investigation report that detailed every instance of cheating and unsportsmanlike conduct. Preston Vaughan has violated not only our club's ethics policies, but also State Athletic Commission regulations, she announced. Effective immediately, all of his titles from the past 5 years are being revoked, and his membership is suspended. The sponsors who had flocked to Preston for years withdrew their support en masse. His carefully constructed image as the golden boy of competitive shooting crumbled in a matter of days. Meanwhile, Grace found herself in an unexpected position. The $50,000 prize donated to the American Veteran Support Fund, as promised, had generated enough publicity to triple the organization's monthly donations. They offered her a position as spokesperson, but Grace had a different idea. "I want to teach," she told the fund's director, "not competitive shooting, but practical skills for veterans who need to find their confidence again." 6 months later, the Ethan Rhodes Memorial Training Facility opened in Denver, partially funded by an anonymous donor who turned out to be Preston Vaughan himself. In a private meeting with Grace, he had offered a public apology and a substantial donation to the Veterans Fund. "Why are you doing this?" Grace had asked. Preston, stripped of his arrogance and forced to confront his own behavior, had been honest, for perhaps the first time in years, "because I knew I couldn't beat you fairly. You weren't just shooting to win, you were shooting like you were protecting something sacred. I've never faced anyone like that before." Grace's first class consisted of 6 veterans, each carrying visible and invisible wounds from their service. She stood before them not as a champion or celebrity, but as someone who understood loss and the long road back to wholeness. "I'm not here to teach you to be perfect," she said, her voice steady and warm. "I'm here to teach you that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up every time you do." By the 3rd session, one student had hit their first bullseye in months. By the 5th, a veteran with severe PTSD told Grace, "For the first time in years, I felt my heart settle when I pulled the trigger." At the facility's first anniversary gala, the fund announced a new scholarship program, the Ethan Phantom Rhodes Excellence Scholarship, providing training and certification for veterans who wanted to become firearms instructors themselves. Grace sat quietly in the audience as the first scholarship recipient, a former Marine who had nearly lost his mobility in an IED explosion, took the stage to accept his award. She twisted her wedding ring gently, a habit that had evolved from nervous gesture to quiet ritual of remembrance. "I kept the promise," she whispered to herself, knowing somehow that Ethan could hear her. The woman who had once been mocked for her worn clothes and modest equipment had done more than defeat a champion. She had transformed pain into purpose, turning a moment of public humiliation into a movement that would help thousands of veterans find their own strength. Grace Taylor's story wasn't just about perfect aim or public vindication. It was about the quiet courage to stand up when everything inside you wants to sit down, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from refusing to be defeated yourself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.